Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Russian symbolism. Symbolism was a major movement in early 20th century Russia, and it's the main reason, or one of the main reasons, why early 20th century Russian literature is known as the Silver Age of literature, and specifically the Silver Age of poetry. The 1820s and 1830s, the era of Pushkin, Lermontov, and Borotinsky, was the golden age of Russian poetry. The first 2 decades of the 20th century was the Silver Age of Russian poetry, and it was also when Russian symbolism flourished. Just like decadence, or the décadence, with which it is closely allied, symbolism arose in the second half of the 19th century in France. It was inspired by latter 19th century French poets, especially Baudelaire and his Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil, which was a collection of poems sort of celebrating morbid subjects. And symbolism was a reaction against realism. So realism focused on reality, obviously, on conveying everyday existence. It was very interested in kind of gritty, daily life, ordinary activities, and the lives of ordinary people. Symbolism didn't want that anymore. It wanted to convey feelings. It wanted to convey ecstatic higher states. It wanted to put people in touch with some kind of higher spiritual reality. And so instead of emphasizing everyday reality and things that you could see, touch, and smell, and your sort of day-to-day experiences and ordinary people, it emphasized mysticism and spirituality and ecstatic or mystic or occult states. It was also very interested in wordplay and formal experimentation. So this was the time when things like free verse rose and people started experimenting with free verse. Free verse, by the way, is when you have neither rhyme nor meter. So normally verse is considered to have both rhyme and some kind of meter. Blank verse is when you have meter but no rhyme, and free verse is when you have neither rhyme nor meter. Free verse is now the dominant system of versification in a lot of Western poetry, and that was something that arose during this period, during the period of symbolism. And we liked it so much that we've never really moved forward in the West. Symbolism was also a period of tremendous experimentation in the visual and dramatic arts. So we saw a tremendous interest in and revival in and experimentation in literature, especially poetry. So realism was largely oriented towards prose. Symbolism returned to poetry. We also see all this experimentation in the visual arts. So for example, the picture here in the PowerPoint on this slide is by Gustav Klimt, who is a major symbolist artist in the West. The picture on the first slide is by Mikhail Vrubel, who was a major symbolist artist in Russia. And so it was this kind of unifying theory that unified or influenced pretty much all the artistic forms of the period: literature, visual arts, drama, dance, and so on and so forth. Symbolism arrived in Russia in the 1890s, and it was brought to Russia by Valery Brusov, whom we already discussed relative to décadence, and Dmitry Merezhkovsky. Both of them deliberately decided to introduce symbolism to Russian literature and basically create this new literary movement. They had encountered symbolism in French literature, and they decided to bring symbolism and the décadence to Russia. So in the 1890s, they put out a series of articles about symbolism, and Valery Brusov put out a series of anthologies that he claimed were by new Russian symbolist artists. It was actually all him writing under different pen names. But he created the impression that there were lots and lots of symbolist artists writing in Russia and sort of single-handedly created the symbolist movement. As I mentioned, symbolism was also popular in other art forms and in Russia, just like in the West. It became very popular as a visual art form. So you see here one of the first major symbolist paintings, the vision that appeared to the youth Bartholomew by Mikhail Nesterov. And again, Mikhail Vrubel was one of the most important Russian symbolist artists, and his most important picture, A Demon Seated, is on the first slide. If you remember from the lecture on the décadence that Valery Brusov was instrumental in bringing in the décadence to Russia, and you might wonder, well, what's the difference between symbolism and decadence or décadence? And they were very similar. They arose at about the same time, although decadence maybe arose a little bit earlier, but maybe only by 4 or 5 years. So they were basically contemporaneous, and the important figures in one are often important figures in the other. So, for example, Brusov in Russia or Baudelaire in France. And they shared a lot of similarities, such as experimentation in form, the breaking of taboos, the interest in sexuality. But symbolism, when people were writing or painting in a symbolist vein, they were emphasizing spirituality and achieving a higher spiritual state. That your art was supposed to be full of symbols and was supposed to be a gateway to a higher, more perfect reality or some kind of higher form of existence. It was supposed to act as some kind of revelation to give people spiritual enlightenment. Meanwhile, decadent literature and art was again focused on taboos and breaking conventions and experimenting with form, but it mainly focused on that which was morbid. It focused on decay, pornography, death, sort of reveling in the dark, and specifically kind of the degraded side in human life. So an example of these two different trends as seen in Brusov. Brusov had a poem called The Slave, which I believe I mentioned in the Décadence lecture, about a slave who's chained to the foot of the empress's bed and has to watch her making love to other men. That was this sort of interest in this very taboo topic, sexuality, and this kind of dark and degrading sexuality. There is in that poem an aspect of spirituality or achieving a higher state, because the slave achieves some kind of enlightenment by what he's witnessed, but nonetheless, this is this focus on the taboo, the dark, the morbid, the degrading. But for symbolism, one of the most important symbolist poems was Valery Brusov's Tvorчество, or Creation. And Tvorчество is about seeing the shadows of images on the wall and how these ideas, these images of yet to be made creations. It starts off with the line «Тень несозданных созданий», the shadow of uncreated creations. And it's about how these shadows of uncreated creations appear to the poet in dreams, just like the shadows of images on the wall. And so it's this focus on creativity and spiritual insight and seeing something beyond ordinary reality and using it to create art. So that was the main focus of symbolism, the symbolist trend of art at the time, whereas the décadence focused mainly on the taboo, the morbid, and images of death and decay. Symbolism was introduced to Russian society, Russian culture in the 1890s, and its key proponents were Brusov and Merezhkovsky, and Merezhkovsky's wife, Zinaida Gippius, who was one of the early important female poets in Russian literature. But it didn't really become the dominant form of Russian poetry and Russian literature at the time until the rise of the second generation of Russian symbolists in the early 20th century, in around 1905, 1910. And the main figures of the second generation of Russian symbolism were Alexander Blok, whom we'll be reading, and Andrei Biely. You can see a portrait of Andrei Biely there on the right on the PowerPoint, and it was done by an important early 20th century Russian symbolist artist, Leon Bakst. And Biely, unfortunately, we're not going to read Biely in this course, but he's very interesting and very challenging. So if you ever want to step it up, take your Russian reading to the next level, Biely is a good place to start. And he was very experimental with form. And he wrote poetry. One of his main collections was called Zolota v Lazuri, Gold and Azure. And it was all about the sun and achieving spiritual revelation through contact with the sun, which was a major theme in symbolist writing. This contact with the sun and the importance of the sun. So the Romantics were very interested in nature in general, and especially the sublime, especially mountain vistas and mountain ranges. These symbolists were also interested in nature, but they were primarily interested in contact with the sun, and they did a lot of sunbathing and things like that. They were also fascinated with water, especially lakes, and they believed that certain lakes in Finland, especially Lake Saimaa in eastern Finland, were portals to this spiritual realm, and that you could access the spiritual realm through going to Lake Saimaa in Finland, which I have visited and is indeed a very beautiful lake. So Biely experimented in form. He wrote these poems. He wrote this collection of poetry, Zolota v Lazuri, Gold and Azure. He also experimented with prose. So he was one of the few major symbolist prose writers. And he tried to do things like write literary symphonies, literaturnie symfonii, or dramatic symphonies, dramatische symfonii, in which he tried to recreate the experience of a symphony in prose form. It sounds really cool. Actually reading it can be a little more challenging. So I have read his literary symphonies, and they are very interesting, but I also found it very hard going. I should probably reread them at some point, and I would appreciate them more now. Nonetheless, they're not the kind of thing that you just jump into, especially reading in a second language. His major work, his most important work, was his novel Peterburg, or Petersburg, which was this kind of precursor to modernism. It's considered to be the most important symbolist novel that was written in the period, and is also sometimes seen as a precursor to Joyce's Ulysses. So Biely was kind of working ahead of Joyce and experimenting things that Joyce would then later do in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. So that's a short overview of Russian symbolism. We'll go into it in more depth when we actually discuss Bloch. But it's important to understand that Bloch was simply the most well-known, most popular, and in some ways, although not in other ways, maybe the most important symbolist writer in Russia. The most important because he made it popular, but he was probably less influential in actually creating it as a movement or experimenting with it as a movement than, for example, Brusov, Merezhkovsky, Gippius, and Biely.